Hello, everyone. This is a short lecture that we wanted to bring to you to give you a broad overview of a timeline of colonial slavery and how slavery develops in the 13 colonies, even before we have America, right? So this is not going to go past Revolutionary War or even into early days of America. We'll talk about that later. So keep in mind that if you want to take notes on this, the text on the slide is really more to just help with years to put on your timeline and spelling of people's names and things like that. This is not an exhaustive list of information and everything that you need to know. I would even maybe leave a little space in between each year because we're going to be kind of skipping years and jumping ahead. This is just a starting point for colonial slavery. So keep in mind that the slavery is entering into the English colonies. These are 13 independent, very autonomous colonies, autonomous from one another, right? They have their own elected bodies in many instances of colonists that are governing. They're connected to the crown, sure, but or their proprietor, excuse me. But for the most part, they're doing their own thing. So all the colonies at one point had slavery. It's not just in the southern colonies. So keep that in mind for our conversation today. You also have indentured servitude being the precursor for go-to labor source before we get to slavery. So keep that in mind. So our first date on the timeline, 1619, 20 slaves being brought, recorded to Jamestown, Virginia, from a Dutch triangular trade participant, and you have to remember that 1607 is whenever Jamestown was founded. So this is very early on in Jamestown, in Virginia and the colonies in general, and everything is being built from the ground up, right? Cities, farms, government, social norms, societal expectations, laws, everything. The House of Burgesses in Virginia we're going to be, they're the ones who are drafting the laws and creating society, societal norms and things like that in Virginia. And the House of Burgesses and the laws that they pass and what goes on in Virginia is going to be kind of our lens that we're looking through a lot of this today, because they pass a lot of sweeping legislation that defines what slavery is going to be going forward in the colonies and then in America once it is established. So just kind of keep that in mind, that as things happen, lawmakers have to adjust and try and keep society the way they want it to be. Now, if we fast forward to 1662, so a little bit less than 50 years, this is where a very important law is passed, known as hereditary slavery. And what this does is, remember, this is just under 50 years after the first slaves arrive. And so there's this time for this problem to develop. And the problem is that you now have children of slaves coming into court and saying, I should be free. And the reason for it was because their father was, their slave owner, like their owner, right? Or a white person who was a free person who worked on the farm, or things like that. And so their Virginia lawmakers have to then adapt to this and figure, how can we keep these many people enslaved as we can? And so they pass these hereditary slavery laws that it doesn't matter who your father is, it just depends on who your mother is, the condition of your mother, being free or slave. So if your mother's a slave, then you're a slave. And that's their workaround of this, sexual abuse and whatnot that's occurring on these plantations and on these farms. And so it doesn't matter if your father's the King of England, right? If your mom's a slave, you're a slave. Remember, they're defining social norms and setting these things in motion. One of the biggest things for colonial slavery is Bacon's Rebellion. You might think that because we're talking about colonial slavery, that Nathaniel Bacon must have been a slave, but he wasn't. He was actually a pretty wealthy landowner himself. Bacon wanted to gain. Virginia eventually kind of gets landlocked, right? There's not as much land to be had in the colony because it's just full. It's filling up with farms and plantations, and so Bacon wants to go west of the colony of Virginia's borders, but he's not able to because Governor William Berkeley prohibits it. The land is inhabited by native tribes, and Berkeley doesn't want to rock the boat, right? He has this peaceful agreement with those tribes. Bacon doesn't like that. He wants to gain more land, gain more money, societal power, move up the social ladder to be even more elite than he is. And so he assembles a crew made up of other white landowners, white indentured servants, and there are even a few African slaves that get roped into this as well. They march into Jamestown, chase Berkeley out of town, burn Jamestown to the ground, and then kind of take over for a little bit. Bacon ends up dying of dysentery shortly after. English crown sends people to establish order. A lot of people are executed, and then the rebellion is squashed. But what happens is they say, how can we prevent this from happening again? And their solution is to do away with indentured servitude and make slavery kind of the go-to labor force, right? End all be all. And so indentured servitude, because of this and other factors like the economy and stuff improving in England, is Bacon's rebellion puts the nail in the coffin of indentured servitude in the 13 colonies. So, Bacon's rebellion, I forgot to put a year on here. I don't know if I said earlier, but it was 1676. So, shaping societal norms, other laws continued to address social issues and to try and keep things the way the Virginian lawmakers want them to be. And so in 1691, they passed laws that make it illegal for different races to marry one another, right? So just to keep in mind a little perspective of how far-reaching these laws are, interracial marriage was not made legal in Virginia until 1967. My mom was a teenager, right, with the Loving v. Virginia Supreme Court case. There's even a Viggo Mortensen movie about it that came out a couple years ago called Loving. So 1967. Another law that was passed in the late 1690s discouraged manumission, freeing of slaves, right? Often upon your death and your will. And so what they would do is they put this law in place that put a really high tax on freeing a slave and also other things that hoops you had to jump through. And so what slave owners ended up doing is saying, well, it's not even worth it. I might as well just pass them down in my will to, my kids, or sell them and, whatever, to pay off debt that I have. So anything that the Virginian lawmakers can do to keep things the way they are in society, to keep the enslaved population enslaved. Turning point for the number of slaves in America, it really skyrockets in the late 1600s whenever the Rice Kingdom in the Deep South is established, primarily in South Carolina. So what happens is rice is discovered to do really well in these southernmost colonies, and rice requires a large labor force. So you have a ton of slaves being imported into these southernmost colonies within the triangular trade system. And also what is really terrible is the slave laws, slave codes, punishments are often more punitive or harsh because of this. Because whenever you eventually in South Carolina have more enslaved people than white people in the colony, people get nervous about uprisings, and so they make harsher treatments. Also, a lot of the wealthy landowners were kind of transplanted from Barbados or other places like in the Caribbean and things like that. And so they brought those very harsh slave codes and slave laws and punishments with them to the English colonies as well. There's not a whole lot, especially with a lot of these laws being established, preventing slaves from being freed or making it more difficult. Really, the only option for slaves at this point is to run away. And so, one of the biggest havens or safe places for slaves during the English in the English colonies is in Spanish-controlled Florida. And so, slaves would run away. If they made it to Florida, then they could be free, as long as owners didn't come into Florida and then find them and bring them back. Um, One of the first slave rebellions that's associated with Spanish Florida is the Stono Rebellion. So this is in Stono, South Carolina. Slaves rise up, flee to Florida. They don't make it. They're cut off. Most of them are executed or brought back to their owners. But that's one of the first examples of colonial slave rebellion, large scale. Lastly, some early abolitionist efforts. And so this is, all the way up, kind of early 1700s is where you start seeing a lot of this kind of take off. Also corresponds with First Great Awakening, but people will, abolitionists are people who tried to end slavery. Um, the One of the main things that they do at first is they write these stories to tell the story of former slaves or enslaved people, their experiences, with slavery, to tell how horrible it is, put in a pamphlet, circulated around. The other thing is religious appeals, especially with the First Great Awakening and more free blacks and enslaved blacks entering into the fold of Christianity. It's People say, man, I feel really icky that the fact that I'm a Christian and other Christians are enslaved, right? And so that becomes like a big turning point for people. And not everybody feels that way, but um, some people say that I don't feel right about this, especially because they're converting to Christianity, right? So that's a big deal for early abolitionist efforts. So I hope this gave you a good starting point, kind of a broad overview of like how do we get to some of these slave society and plantation society and things that we're familiar with, more like on the cusp of the Civil War. This is where some of these early social norms and laws are being put into place.